obviously the consequence of having a Canadian team in these finals for the first time, the first truly international NBA finals for your sport, which is so global in nature right now. What does that mean for the league? What specifically does that mean for the NBA to have Canada in these finals?
Yeah, well, to your point, it clearly demonstrates what an international sport we are. I mean, I look at what progress we've made in Canada since we expanded in '94. We have more players from Canada, other than the United States, than any other country right now. I think we have 13 players from Canada right now. The sport has become enormously popular with young people there. And also Toronto in particularly is an incredibly diverse city. I think it's very representative of the modern NBA, where 25% of our league is composed of players that were born outside the United States. So I think it's a signal of sorts to a global market. Of course, we've talked about expanding potentially to other countries as well, and I think it also demonstrates that, I mean, in the NBA world, still a relatively young franchise, having come into the league in '94, and look at the progress they've made, and I think finally just demonstrates what you can do with strong ownership as they have there, and great management, and so we're thrilled.
And as a former Raptor, I'm really happy for Toronto, because it's one thing when you play in the United States, you have a city or a state rooting for a team. It's something vastly different when you have an entire country rooting for a team. And that's where you see the massive crowds outside at Jurassic Park. This is something that we normally don't see in the NBA. And it's really refreshing that it's going to get a chance to play out on the final stage.
It almost has like a college atmosphere to it. Again, Jalen will be there by the end of the day, and I'm sure you'll be there, of course, tomorrow night for Game 1. I want to get to a bunch of other issues around the sport here, and I will start with this, because we're all anticipating, as well as these finals, obviously, and then the draft, and then July 1st will come, and we, the Get Up crew, are going to do a bunch of specials around that, because that's become such an incredibly important week. And I will admit, when this first started 5-6 years ago, whenever it was, when a lot of big star players started moving around in the summers, my initial reaction was, this is terrible for the NBA. And I sit here today, and I think I have to admit I was wrong. My sense of it is this has actually wound up increasing the interest in the sport. What data do you have that demonstrates the way player movement has impacted fans' interest in all of your games?
Data? I'd say it's a balance. So we have a system still designed to create an advantage for the incumbent team. I mean, the whole notion of the supermax, whole notion of a longer contract for a player on your team. So it's not that we want to disfavor the team that currently has that player under contract, even when they become free agents. But on the other hand, it's also a way of rebirth, of reforming a franchise. And so you want a certain amount of change in the league. You know, and the other part that gets lost sometimes when changing the system and creating shorter contracts, it also creates greater incentives for players. I mean, players are like anybody else who, has a contract. And to the extent where you have essentially 4- and 5-year contracts right now, it creates very different incentives when players are getting to the end of those contracts than it did in the old days when guys used to have 9-year contracts and 7-year contracts. And if you have a system where you have a set pool of money, so roughly now 50% of the money goes to the players, it becomes an issue of how that money is going to get distributed. And I think our theory was, if you go to shorter contracts, you have less money that isn't being utilized. If you have guys, in essence, who were incredibly valuable and had the leverage to get a 9-year contract, but then everyone sort of realized when they got their 9-year contract, maybe they're going to have 5 great years and tail off. This way, the players who deserve the money are still getting it, but then next group of players get money because there's more free agency. And so we're at the point now where roughly 40% of our players will be free agents this summer. So we think it's good for the league. I get it from the other standpoint, for a team that's losing that free agent. And then the question is, how do you build a system where teams are, in essence, players are giving those teams appropriate notice so that they don't end up, in essence, with nothing when it comes to the end of that contract, and the player who they thought was going to stay decides they're going to leave.
Commissioner, this is the most anticipated offseason I can recall in the history of the NBA. As we go into the NBA Finals, the best players on each team, Kevin Durant and Kawhi Leonard, are amongst those 40% free agents you just talked about. There's a good chance that both of those guys could be on new teams come next season. Do you feel like this is good for the game?
First, I don't know if there's a good chance that both those players will be on new teams next season. I really don't, and I'm not even sure they know. I think my experience in dealing with these players, they're still young men. I think different people suggest different things to them. Ideas change, success, failure have impacts on their decisions. But as I said, I think it's got to be a balance. I respect their right to become free agents. Teams, everyone with eyes wide open signed those players, certain length contracts. I mean, the case out in Golden State, they made a decision there to enter into shorter contracts with their players. It created more flexibility for everyone. So we'll see. I mean, it's hard for me to jump over the finals right now that haven't started and go directly to free agency. But the answer is I really don't know. I will say sort of where I started. There is a preference for players to stay with their team. It's the way we, together with the Players Association, built the collective bargaining agreement. So players are giving up money to leave their team. People have also suggested to us that maybe in our system they're not giving up enough money, that there should be even a greater incentive for players to stay in their current team. But that's something we're constantly trying to calibrate and find the right balance.